Let's go back to our conference, and now I'll give the floor to Dr. Teresa Filipe, who is graduated in philosophy, minor in translation, and obtained a master's degree in contemporary philosophy, both at the University of Évora, Portugal. She was a research fellow at the project edition of the complete works of Eduardo Lourenço, funded by Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian, Universidade de Évora. She is the author of Metafísica da Revolução Poética e Política no Ensaísmo de Eduardo Lourenço and co-translator of O Nomear e a Necessidade by Saul Kripke. She has recently obtained her PhD in textual criticism with a thesis dedicated to the study and digital edition of Fernando Pessoa's Marginalia at the School of Arts and Humanities, University of Lisbon. She is a member of the Center of Linguistics of the University of Lisbon. Her current main research interests focus on Fernando Pessoa, textual criticism, writers' libraries, and digital marginalia. Teresa, please.
Thank you, Professor Enrico. Thank you all for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So I'll just start reading. To look for possible sources of invention involved in the writing of a text that is still to be fully transcribed, of which we know very little about, plus a text written over a large period, which means that it is likely to have received different influences from different sources, is probably one of the ways to get close to madness. I think Pessoa would have approved of it. Bearing that in mind, the present talk will identify pieces of knowledge gathered from Pessoa's private library, also from previous references to the Duke of Parma made by Pessoa's scholars, and then step into the Duke's papers, hoping to contribute to a better insight of the play. Naturally, what are now suggestions will be clearer, I hope, once the full transcription is done and the text is studied. More than half of the titles in Pessoa's private library are in English and devoted to English literature, crossing different periods. Although in a much lesser degree, Pessoa's attention to Italian literature is also important. If we look at it, we find titles with publishing dates from 1853 to 1929. For instance, Pessoa kept in his library a French translation of Poésie published in 1853 by the Italian poet and satirist Giuseppe Giusti. One volume devoted to Italian literature by Gatti, published post-1905, or 2 volumes by Giacomo Leopardi, one French translation of his complete poetry, and Canti Celti from 1924. Most significant was Pessoa's interest in Dante's La Divina Commedia, of which he owned 3 editions, one in French, one Italian, and one in English, published between 1905 and 1915. Pessoa also kept a critical study of the comedy by Helen Dunbar, published in 1929. These books and others referred to in this paper can be consulted online at Fernando Pessoa's House website. Apart from these, and although there are no surviving books by these authors at the private library, one should not forget the importance of the reading of Italian criminologists, such as Lombroso and Garofalo, in the building of Pessoa's own thought on matters such as the nature of crime, madness, or genius. Now, I would like to suggest that apart from possible sources in text by other authors, influences may come from an author's own texts. Similar to other projects, Pessoa spent a great deal of time in the writing of the Duke of Parma, while also working in different other texts. In a recent biography on Pessoa written by Richard Zenith, it is suggested that Pessoa started thinking about the Duke in 1909, but as far as I know, he fails to show evidence of it. The Duke of Parma is included, among others, in a list written on a notebook dated 1909, document 144D7. And in one document with lines from the Duke on which Pessoa inscribed the more recent date, 4th of January 1935. So this shows it was from a long period that he was working in this text. In one of these lists, dated 1921, the writing of the Duke appears attributed to Pessoa himself, and in a loose sheet probably belonging to the years 1920 to 27, and where several other works are listed, the Duke of Parma appears designated by Pessoa as the example of a drama. And this was something Professor Enrico has also shown this document. Now, covering such a substantial time, almost all of Pessoa's adult life, and being written whilst producing many other texts, it is highly probable that these texts contaminate each other. In one document containing a list of characters for the Duke of Parma, also exhibiting in the right margin the name and address of one of Pessoa's fictitious authors, Alexander Serge, Pessoa states 10 different characters, but it is incomplete. It is missing at least one character whose name starts with a M, and which can be found in numerous of the Duke's documents. Another hypothesis would be that this character changed its name. This document also shows that by the time it was written, there existed a character named Valerio, designated as an old ex-chancellor that indeed appears in the Duke papers. Now, one document containing plot instructions for Act 1 of the Duke exhibits a curious substitution in the 6th line from Vincenzo is changed to Valerio above. Vincenzo is a character in Marino, another English play by Pessoa, only recently edited by Carlos Pitella Leite in 2021. According to Pitella, Pessoa started working in Marino some years before the Duke. The earliest papers belong to 1903 as dated by Pitella. But characteristically of Pessoa, he works successively on the play, so it is likely that at some point Pessoa was working on both plays almost simultaneously. In this way, the substitution may represent a lapse. Pessoa was thinking in Marino's Vincenzo while working in the Duke's text and immediately changed it to Valerio. Or at some point, the two characters may have shared more than the obvious resemblances of their names. It is worth mentioning that in another document, headed by the abbreviation of D of P, that stands for Duke of Parma, we can find the name Vincenzo, here as Lord Vincenzo, described as that almost revered fool who had burdened me with favors till I ached. Moving to another aspect of the play, and as some scholars have noted, the Duke of Parma is embedded with Shakespearean resonances. It is written in old-fashionable English that one can observe, for instance, in the use of words like thou, dost, thy, or hast. It adds to these the title explicitly referring to Italy and the usage of Italian and French references. In Pessoa's Duke, these can be found in the use of French words and expressions. For instance, when the Duke says optime, or in document 11.5d1, Valerio or Vincenzo say un son de quality, and if the transcribing proves correct, Alberto uses Old English in roquelaire, which, according to Collins' English Dictionary, is an obsolete spelling of roquelaure, a lined and trimmed cloak that reaches to the knees, often with bright color lining and trimmed with fur. I must say the word optime, which I here propose to be French in consonance with the existence of other French words in the play, could also be interpreted as Latin. So we must really wait to have more of the text transcribed. Nevertheless, my point here is to identify some of the elements in the play that contribute to the idea that Pessoa's Duke of Parma is embedded with Shakespearean resonances, and that would still work out even if the word is Latin. Apart from these specific occurrences, one may say the whole text, and as Zenith puts it, I quote, the tone, phrasing, and dramatic method of Pessoa's play makes us think of Shakespeare, end of quote. In one of the Duke's speeches, Pessoa uses words and repetitions that immediately sound like the English bard. And I read, And there are many things, such as eyes that look in several manners, and lips that are looked at past speech, and the like, and the like, and the like, between the desire and the avowed act. Or in, we are not all beggars of the tool, we have sonnets, sir, and roundels too, and we make meetings for love, and dress to come nakedness. No, speak not to me of dreams, for we all dream till we sleep. Now, this last sentence immediately makes me think of the Tempest's famous lines, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep," which, by the way, Pessoa strived to translate into Portuguese. Furthermore, in a sheet of paper containing a scene from The Duke, Pessoa makes an explicit reference to some of Shakespeare's texts, a gesture which Richard Zenith, in his 2021 biography, interprets as Pessoa wanting, and I quote, "to be sure that his own tragedy had a comparable length, fewer lines than Hamlet, which is rarely performed in its entirety, but no less than Macbeth," end of quote. In fact, page numbers annotated in this document correspond to the ones in Shakespeare's The Complete Works, edited in London, Oxford University Press, of which a personal copy can be found at Pessoa's private library. If we look at the document, apart from references to Shakespearean dramas already pointed out by Zenith, one can also read in Pessoa's hand sonnets, annotated inside a pencil-drawn square box in the right lower half of the page, magnified. I remind you that Pessoa read, studied, and wrote extensively on Shakespeare regarding different aspects of his work as well as his alleged biography, probably like he hasn't done to any other author. Looking in Pessoa's reading of the sonnets included in the complete works, we will find that if Shakespeare's influence in The Duke is to be taken as certain, so should be the revival of Elizabethan theatre in the late 19th century. We can witness this happening in Pessoa because if we turn to his private copy of the sonnets and observe the marginalia left there, we are drawn to the conclusion that his personal reading was deeply influenced by one of the most influential 19th century reviver of Elizabethan theatre with all its moods, ambiances, and also Italian lines and locations. I mean Oscar Wilde. Significantly, on page 1210 of the sonnets, Pessoa inscribed the initials OW that stands for Oscar Wilde. So, regarding possible affinities between Pessoa's Duke of Parma and Wilde, this information might add something to the already mentioned similarity with the Duchess of Padua, a play that also imitated Shakespeare, as put forward in the already mentioned work by Zenith. Pessoa's reading of Shakespeare's sonnet seemed therefore linked to Wilde's, and as Mariana Grey Castro puts it, by the intriguing thesis on them as put forward in the portrait of Mr. W. H. The Portrait of Mr. W. H. is a novel written by Wilde in 1889. Pessoa kept in his library 2 editions of this novel, a French translation published in 1906 and an English edition included in Lord Arthur Saville's Crime and Other Prose Pieces, published in 1909, the latest exhibiting marginalia in Pessoa's hand. It should be said that Wilde's influence on Pessoa extended to many different areas, from literary criticism to aesthetics, moral and philosophical views. In André Gide's biography of Wilde, for example, of which Pessoa owned a copy, marginalia reveal attention to different passages related to art and artists, to Wilde's paganism or his more personal behavior characteristics that didn't avoid polemics. In Fernando Pessoa Shakespeare, The Invention of Heteronyms, Mariana Grey de Castro gives a solid account on how Pessoa's reading of the sonnets stems from 19th century sources and consistently identifies Pessoa's marginalia in the sonnets as a testing of Wilde's arguments explicitly in the portrait of Mr. W.H. Here, Wilde argues that the sonnets can prove Shakespeare's homosexuality by identifying Willie Hughes as Mr. W.H., the person to whom the sonnets are dedicated in the front page. Willie Hughes was supposed to be a boy actor in Shakespeare Theatre Company. Further, Wilde argues that several words used in the sonnets are meant to reproduce the sound of pronouncing the name Hughes, and Pessoa marked these instances, both in his copy of Wilde's portrait and in Shakespeare's sonnets. For example, Wilde indicates that in Sonnet 20 we read, "A man in hue, all hues in his controlling," informing that in the original edition of the sonnets, Hughes is printed with a capital letter and in italics. This was marked by Pessoa in both books. Also significantly, Wilde informs of the play upon words, use to resemble hues, in Sonnet 78, and Pessoa marked this in his copy of the sonnets, the same zone where he inscribed, OW, that stands as mentioned for us, Oscar Wilde. Pessoa marked several other occurrences of the word use, and also as indicated by Wilde, the name will in sonnets 135 and 143, respectively marked by Pessoa in his copy. Whether or not Pessoa was convinced by Wilde's theory, our focus here is Pessoa's interest in the alleged play upon words, something that can also be found, for instance, in other zones of his copy of the complete works. In Act 5, Scene 1 of The Tempest, a play Pessoa read and almost entirely translated into Portuguese, he underlines words that resonate the bard's name Shakespeare's. It must be reminded that some critics argue that some aspects of the main character of the play, Prospero, is to be taken as Shakespeare himself, and Pessoa seems to be testing that theory. What seems to catch Pessoa's attention is how a double meaning is to be found in the text. Now, if we leave Pessoa's private library and look at texts he produced on Shakespeare, particularly the sonnets, we find precisely a reference to it in document 70A1. Double meanings in Elizabethan verse, to which he adds in brackets Shakespeare sonnets, adding a question mark, probably indicate he was still working on it. Below, Pessoa writes Shakespeare tendency to excess, controlled by the sonnet and the drama. He then refers to the abruptness of endings and consequent non-unity of many of the sonnets. As you can see, Pessoa also refers to Spenser, a line of inquiry that could also be interesting to explore. So in these fragments, what I read is a particular attention to structural aspects of composition, one of them being the possibility given by Elizabethan verse of offering double meanings, as it seems Pessoa has found in the sonnets and at least on one occasion in The Tempest. This attention to formal aspects of composition and other inquiries into language lead me to my next suggestion. Taking a quick survey in Portuguese National Library database available online through works mentioning Parma, published up to 1909, I found a curious reference. In 1775, Condillac's Cours d'études pour l'instruction du Prince de Parme came out. It is a work constituted by 13 volumes dedicated to the education of young Ferdinand of Parma, grandson to Louis XV. It is worth remembering that at this time, Italy and France shared close institutional relations, for they belonged to the same royal families, the Bourbons, and let us remember that one character in Pessoa's Duke is a Duke of Burgundy. In his Cours d'études, Condillac includes studies on grammar, the art of writing, the art of thinking, etc. In the first part of the first book, one reads in the summary that it is, I quote, at the analysis of thought that one must look for the principles of language. And the summary goes on to speech analysis, grammar, elements of speech. If we open the very first page, in cours d'études, we read Première partie de l'analyse de discours, chapitre 1 du langage d'action. Now, from a few transcriptions of the Duke's text, I was able to carry on with the always generous aid from Jérôme Pizarro. Some words often appear: dream, sleep, madness, philosophy, and language. Regarding this last one, in 4 occurrences, the Duke or other characters in the play refer to different types of language. And in 1 occasion, at least, there's an attempt to define one of these types. In 1 document, one reads, "This is private language, my lord." In a dialogue between Lord M and Alberto, a counselor to the Duke, Alberto speaks of a prophet's language, a phrase that is followed by a description of what this might be. And in the same document, he speaks of chaste language. In another document, there's a reference to naked language, to which another character answers, "I, so are we by nature." So I think, or I propose, these 4 references to different types of language, coupled with the attempt to define and to identify one type, the naked language, to the human condition, shows that in the Duke's text there might be an attempt to focus on the nature and effects of language, as Condillac did. It is still not clear to what extent Pessoa read Condillac, but it is certain that he read the French philosopher. Traité de Sensation is mentioned in a notebook dated Aquo 1906. This notebook, transcribed and published by Pizarro in 2021, exhibits the name of Alexander Serge, followed by the date September 1906, and the indication philosophy, etc. on the title page. Notebook 144H was used to draft poems and notes, and also as a reading or to read list with surnames of authors written in black ink according to the notebook's alphabetic labels. Besides the mention to Condillac, the notebook also exhibits on page 2 one annotation that can be related to the Duke. It reads as follows: King Laert cancelled and, added above, Duke, give me a land big as the heavens where to put this rage in. And there's a newest reading of this word land to a body, which would be like, give me a body big as the heavens where to put this rage in. Where is a fool to make a poem of this? A reference to King Laert, also cancelled, can be found in another document of the Duke. Now, regarding Condillac, one sentence must have caused a great impression on Pessoa, since we can find it paraphrased in different parts of the author's estate. One of these exhibits the Portuguese initials to the Book of Disquiet, L do D. It has been dated circa 1930, and reads as follows. I will use Margaret Jewel Costa translation to English. Condillac begins his famous book with the words, "However high we climb and however low we fall, we never escape our own feelings." Although Pessoa does not indicate the book he is referring to, the lines alluded could well be a paraphrase to the first lines of Essai sur l'origine des connaissances humaines, first published in 1746, which starts as follows, and I read from Cambridge translation into English. Whether we raise ourselves, to speak metaphorically, into the heavens or descend into the abyss, we do not go beyond ourselves, and we never perceive anything but our own thought. We also know that at a certain point, Pessoa owned a copy of Condillac's Œuvre Métaphysique, published in 1802, that included the essay on the origin of human knowledge. This book is listed along with the 94 other philosophical titles as books of unknown location in Pessoa's private library catalogue of 2010. Its location is still unknown, but it testifies that at some point Pessoa had the book. The very same thought can be found in at least two other documents. One in a text written in defense of António Boto, a Portuguese modernist author of whom Pessoa edited Canções, a poetry book, friend to Pessoa, and one time accused of literary immorality, pretty much regarding his assumed homosexuality, where Pessoa uses Condiac's theory to prove one never actually lives its own instincts and self-preservation. In this document, Pessoa further argues for the necessary distinction between art and morality. As Condillac well said, no matter how high we climb or how low we go down, we never escape our own sensation. So too, as altruistic as one may be, we never escape from self-satisfaction. The same idea appears in a document attributed to António Mora in the Portuguese critical edition of António Mora's works by Imprensa Nacional Casa da Moeda. Here it is included in this fictitious author project of writing the principles of paganism. Pessoa refers to Kant and to Condillac, pointing a common error to both, that is, of attributing to consciousness the attributes of reality itself. It reads, "Whatever we do, no matter how high we climb or how low we go down, we never escape ourselves and our own sensations. Even in this form, I repeat, this principle represents an error. I have already mentioned the type of error. It consists in attributing to consciousness and even to individual consciousness the attributes of reality itself." In general terms, Condillac argues that experience and sensations are at the basis of human knowledge, therefore contradicting Cartesian theories of innate ideas. Condillac further argues that language is not separate from the human acquisition of knowledge, but it constitutes it. It is actually a major part in the process through which humans give meaning to experience and sensations and form ideas, which means that for Condillac, our ideas are not independent of the linguistic signs with which they come to be associated. Pessoa's particular attention and raw study of formal aspects of language can be widely observed in much of his marginalia, with several books exhibiting work on meter, rhythm, sound, or syntax. This he did, it seems, in order to grasp ways in which language produces concrete effects. Stemming from this work, I believe, Pessoa reveals an attention to the type of investigation which leads him into inquiring the nature of language, how it constitutes the way in which we represent knowledge and, ultimately, oneself. In doing so, he finds a way to enhance criticism on pretense, morality, and prejudice, and defend art. So, in this sense, maybe the Duke's text, its attention to madness, murder, sexual allusions, philosophy, and the language, to name it, can be related to internal contradictions and paradoxes, as it has been said, but also to a ferocious critique of morality and a defense of freedom, of which Oscar Wilde was also a major representative. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Teresa Filipe. Your well-researched and fascinating report is much appreciated.